I would just like to echo Rebecca in saying thank you to everyone for making time to squeeze this onto what I'm sure is a busy mid-semester or mid-quarter calendar. Since we are at the top of the hour, I guess it is time to get started. For those of you guys who are new to STS Futures workshops, we did just want to say a little bit of words sort of introducing the project. We are a graduate student-led initiative. We've got some institutional support from the Center for Science, Technology, Medicine, and Society at UC Berkeley, and we're funded by the UCHRI, but the brunt of our labor is carried out by very enthusiastic graduate students and early career scholars. So that's a thing that we're very, very excited about. Our goals a little bit more generally are to create an STS graduate and alumni community, give STS-oriented students opportunities to identify and also to leverage the specific skills that we acquire as researchers who are poised or becoming poised for the job market. I really love these workshops because they demystify things that are hard and scary about academia if you have never encountered them before. And so it's a really practical way to learn about things that sometimes use a very particular vocabulary. So we've got workshops planned all through 2021, and we've got 2 coming up in April and May, which I hope that you guys will be able to join us for. On April 8th, we'll be hosting The Art of the Op-Ed, which invites a panel of speakers with a successful track record of translating academic research into writing for an audience that's a little bit broader than the academy. So on April 8th, we'll have Margaret O'Meara, Michelle Pridmore-Brown of the LA Review of Books, Lee Vinsel, and UC Berkeley's own Victoria Massey. In May, we'll be hosting a panel on global STS, decolonial methods, and international STS networks. That's going to be hosted by Kat Gutierrez, and we're extremely excited about it. And later on this year, we're going to be putting on a panel on podcasts and how to translate your work for the podcast as a particular medium and sort of how to reach broader audiences with that as a tool set. So thank you guys so much for coming. I really hope that you'll put the future events that we're putting together on your radar. Thank you so much for coming to this event. Elizabeth is going to pop our website and socials in the chat. And please do not hesitate to shoot us an email if you have any questions, comments, feedback, thoughts, or if you just want to be added to the email list for updates. And on that lovely note, I would like to conclude our opening remarks and hand it back over to Rebecca for what I'm sure is going to be a fabulous panel. So thank you so much, Rebecca, for putting all of this together.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Lois, for that wonderful introduction. It's come to my attention that the noise of people entering and leaving the waiting room is not just audible to me, it's audible to everyone. So rest assured, I will do my best to turn that off in the settings in just a moment. However, first, I would like to go ahead and introduce this panel and our amazing array of speakers. And after Lois's general introduction, really all I would like to do is really point to what this panel is trying to do. And we're very proud to announce this second panel discussion for our 2021 academic year, which is Bridging the Two Cultures, Interdisciplinary Public and Digital Humanities Approaches to STS. With this panel, we seek to shed light on a number of questions, like how can humanities methods and foci act as a bridging discourse between scientists, culture workers, and the wider public? How can students and scholars engage critically and usefully with science and technology from a humanities point of view? And finally, what might the implications and the importance be of bringing together these traditionally separate disciplinary discourses, both within and outside the academy? And we're very fortunate tonight to have 5 brilliant scholars with us to discuss their work. Our panelists are working variously at the intersections of STS-oriented pedagogy, the public and digital humanities, and feminist anti-racist approaches to STEM research. We do ask that attendees please refrain from verbally asking questions during or directly after each talk, since I will be moderating a Q&A session after all of our panelists have gotten the chance to speak. However, at any point, you are encouraged to go ahead and use the chat feature to post questions or comments. If they are questions, though, just be sure to indicate who the question is for. Elizabeth will be helping us keep track of relevant questions, and I will then use them to facilitate a conversation with the speakers after the talk. So thank you very much for doing that, Elizabeth. And in order of presentation, tonight we're going to hear first from Lindsay Thomas of the University of Miami. Her talk is titled The Big Humanities, Collaboration and Team-Based Open Research in the Digital Humanities. Next, we will hear from Abigail Droge, Emory University, on her DH and STS-oriented pedagogy design, Reading with Scientists. After Abigail, we'll hear from UCSB's own Nikki Renburg in her talk, Alone, I Am Just One Tree, Community Science and the Archangel Tree Archive. And finally, last but certainly not least, we will hear from Kalindi Vora and Sarah McCullough, Director and Associate Director of the UC Davis Feminist Research Institute, in their talk titled The Science We Are For, Feminist Anti-Racist STS Approaches to STEM. Please join me in welcoming our panelists. I like to use the welcome emoji, the little clap, but you don't have to. All right, and as I previously mentioned, we'll hear first from Lindsay Thomas on the big humanities, collaboration and team-based open research in the digital humanities. Lindsay Thomas is Assistant Professor of English at the University of Miami. Her research and teaching focus on cultural and media studies, contemporary US literature, and the digital humanities. Her book, Training for Catastrophe, Fictions of National Security After 9/11, will be published this month, March 2021, by the University of Minnesota Press. Congratulations, Lindsay. She's also the co-director of What Everyone Says, a digital humanities project that employs a variety of methods in data science, ethnographic research, and textual analysis to examine contemporary public discourse about the humanities on a large scale. Thanks very much, Lindsay, and take it away.
All right, great. Thanks, Rebecca. Hi, everyone. It's good to be here and nice to see you. Hi, Christina in particular. Recognize your Zoom face. Let me share my screen here. Okay, so hopefully you should be seeing my screen. All right, great. So I want to thank, first of all, before I get going, Rebecca, of course, for the invitation to be here, and also the other organizers, Lois, Kat, Elizabeth, and Hannah for their work in making all of this happen. When Rebecca extended the invitation to speak today, she sort of floated the idea of using the project that we worked on for several years, Rebecca, I forget how many, as a way to talk about bridging the two cultures. My talk today is going to take Rebecca up on that offer by thinking through what that bridging looks like in practice. I'll be talking about the What Everyone Says project, or WENS, as I'll refer to it, which I've worked on for several years with Rebecca and Abigail, and I think there are some others here, Christina and others. In my talk today, I'll be drawing inspiration from the long tradition in STS of situated ethnographic research that examines how scientists make knowledge in the lab, as it were. And I'll be performing a sort of quick and dirty and very brief autoethnography of the WENS project. So a really quick intro to the project. It's, as Rebecca said, about examining public discourse about the humanities from news and social media over the past 20 years or so. I'll just throw up this slide, which gives you some basic information about the project. We collected over 4 million documents from LexisNexis, Twitter, and Reddit, and we examined these documents using a variety of techniques and text analysis and machine learning, focusing mainly on topic modeling, which is a sort of automated way of detecting topics or themes within a large body of texts. We also surveyed and held focus group discussions pre-COVID with members of the UCSB and University of Miami campus communities about their thoughts and opinions on the humanities. Again, the sort of overarching goal is to try to understand contemporary public discourse about the humanities and also to understand how this discourse intersects with and departs from everyday opinions and practices. That's the really quick nutshell. The pilot phase of the project began in 2013, and that phase continued through 2017. So I actually started working on this project when I myself was a graduate student at UC Santa Barbara. And that part of the project was funded mainly through sort of various ad hoc grants we got from UC Santa Barbara. Then in 2017, we entered a phase of the project where we received a Mellon grant to fund the project at 3 different institutions, UC Santa Barbara, California State Northridge, and UMiami. And that phase was from 2017 to 2021. We got a little bit of an extension due to COVID, and we're just wrapping up that part now. So there have been a lot of people involved in the project, and this is my attempt to display all of the names. So this is a screenshot from our website. In 2019-2020, which was last academic year and our last full year of funding, the project involved 41 regular participants across 4 different campuses. We actually had participants from the Illinois Institute of Technology as well. And over the life of the project, we've worked with a little bit over 100 people. So as I've already indicated, some members of the project team are here today, and I want to highlight the fact that what I'm going to say draws on and depends upon their labor. That's in fact what I'm going to be talking about, and that's the nature of collaborative work. My perspective is obviously deeply dependent on my status as a project co-PI and a junior tenure track faculty member with relatively stable employment, and I hope we can talk more about that aspect of things in the discussion. Other team members will have different things to say, and I encourage them to say them when we have our discussion. Okay, finally, one more thing before diving into talking about the project. I want to discuss the title, the big humanities. I'm going to tackle the second word first, humanities. So when I speak about the humanities today, I am of course speaking again from my position within literary studies, a position that's important not just because it's my own, but also because it's occupied by the 3 other co-PIs in the project and many other researchers on the project, such as Abigail and Rebecca, but by no means everybody who worked on the project. As we can see in relation to the term digital humanities, which has been notoriously difficult to pin down and define for over 2 decades, the term humanities is an administrative construct that quickly falls apart when you start to talk about actual practices and specific norms. The title of my talk as a whole, the big humanities, obviously refers to the term big science. Since physicist and Oak Ridge National Laboratory Administrator Alvin M. Weinberg excuse me, first used the term in 1961, there's been a lot of debate in STS about what the term big science actually means, whether it's good or bad for science, debates which I'm going to just sort of shove up to the side insofar as they relate to the humanities today. However, starting in the 1990s, researchers in STS began to shift their attention to what James Capshew and Karen Rader identified as the drama of scale, associated with the everyday practice of science in the 20th century. It is partly this drama of scale that has drawn me to use the phrase big humanities in my title, as I'm interested in the implications of conducting research in the humanities with, again, over 100 people situated differently across multiple institutions over the course of what has now been over 7 years. The What Everyone Says project, of course, pales in comparison to actual big science research, especially in terms of overall people power, instrumentation, and funding. So my use of the phrase big humanities is also self-aware and ironic. And I think we should also think here about connections between the concept of big science and another, perhaps slightly more contemporary term that also relies on the drama of scale, big data. However, I am interested in this drama of scale as it relates to the humanities insofar as we're talking about everyday practices of knowledge production. I'm interested in what Peter Gallison has identified as one of the most salient features of the so-called era of big science, quote, a change in the very nature of a life in science. I don't think the practices I will describe today are taking place across the board in the humanities, and I don't think we've entered an era of the big humanities, whatever that would mean, nor do I think we should. I'm not trying to be normative. I don't see our project as a normative model. Rather, in what follows, I describe the outlines of how we have performed the labor of collective research in our project, and I suggest some of the larger issues these practices pose for the nature of a life in the humanities. So the rest of my talk is divided into 2 parts. The first part is practices, and then the second part is, of course, problems. So practices. In her 2009 ethnographic research on digital humanities project teams, Lynn Siemens outlines recommendations for best practices when conducting team-based research in DH. And here they are. I'm going to use these recommendations as a guide for talking through our project's practices, not because I think we always succeeded in employing them, but because they provide a useful way of understanding many of our overall goals in managing the day-to-day work on this research project. I'm going to start by focusing on 2 and 3, deliberate action by the project leader and deliberate action by the team. A central challenge from the beginning of our work on WE1S was how to break up the labor of what is at one level quite a technical project involving complicated data collection and analysis among researchers situated mainly in the humanities who had wide-ranging technical and computational skills. The solution, as you see on the slide, was to break up the larger project into smaller teams organized by or directed by PIs or postdocs or other research assistants. And you can see on the slide here our teams from our last summer camp in 2020. This model was present in the project almost from its very beginning, and it was familiar to me as a model that I had worked in before on previous DH projects I had worked with in graduate school. And you can see here how the teams are sort of divided into what we called issues teams, and then sort of methods or more technical teams. Insofar as what working in a team involved, the sort of everyday practices, the work was often organized through smaller meetings of individual team members, during which we would talk through and organize the work that needed to be done. And then we would report on this work to the larger project team at regular bi-monthly meetings. This is a sort of common structure in a lot of team research. And this brings me to another one of Siemens' recommendations, the fifth one about a balance between digital and in-person communication and collaboration. The work on the project teams proceeded in person mainly because teams were generally, though not always, composed of participants at the same institution. But communications across institutions during the academic year were virtual. So we were using Zoom long before it was cool. But we tried to balance the necessarily virtual nature of our work by holding 5-week, what we called summer research camps in July and early August, during which we gathered at UCSB and CSUN. So there was still partly a virtual component because we were at 2 institutions, to sort of sit in the same room, if you will, and work together. Usually at our summer research camps, we had anywhere from 25 to 30 people at UCSB and 10 to 20 people at CSUN. Last summer, our last research camp was virtual due to COVID. And that actually allowed us to hire more people. So we had our largest summer camp ever last summer. The strategy of team-based work largely succeeded, but one consequence was the compartmentalization of different aspects of the project, particularly the more technical aspects, which I'm just representing through this slide, which shows you, sort of gives you a view of some of our topic modeling visualization interfaces that we used. The sheer number of people involved in WUNS during any given year made this compartmentalization inevitable. But it also made understanding the project as a whole and all of its moving parts increasingly difficult, which is something STS scholars discussing large-scale scientific research have often emphasized. I think this is actually something that distinguishes our project from many other projects in the humanities, even those that are team-based and group-based. I think it's more common for humanities projects to adopt what's often termed an integrative research framework, in which researchers understand the origins and endpoints and everything in between of a long-term research project, which was just not really possible with WUNS. Finally, I want to talk about deliberate training, another one of Siemens' goals. When we started the project, we had the goal of providing regular technical training in topic modeling and other data science methods to project participants. This quickly proved untenable. However, we tried to counter this by opting for a so-called open science model. Like the terms big science, big data, digital humanities, etc., no one really knows what open science is. But in its most general sense, it describes an effort to make research processes transparent to outsiders by posting data, code analysis, and findings online as you go, within certain parameters, which for us involved parameters of copyright. I want to flag here, though, again, that I'm talking strictly within the parameters of our project. And although we adopted some of the framework of the so-called open science movement, we're also aware that this approach has its issues. Critics in STS, in fact, have focused mainly on the ideology of transparency and how this ideology further corporatizes science and scientific practices. They've also discussed the precept adopted from feminist work on data and from Black digital practice more generally, that not all data can or should be open. And I'm thinking here of the work of Lauren Klein and Catherine D'Ignazio, as well as the work of Jessica Murray Johnson, Simone Brown, and others on obfuscation, uncounting, and the violence of reductionism in many data collection efforts. So that being said, I want to briefly sort of touch on 2 ways that we implemented what can broadly be termed an open science model. The first is through a reproducible workflow. And we accomplished this using Jupyter Notebooks, which I don't want to get too much into the weeds here, but basically Jupyter Notebooks are a way of providing a way to interact with and use code and data analysis methods. And in fact, ultimately to reproduce the conditions of our project server environment on your own computer. And this system allows others to use our methods and data to see exactly what we have done to our data and theoretically to reproduce our results. Didn't always work as planned. There were many, many technical snafus, but working with Jupyter Notebooks also allowed us, I think most importantly for our project, within our project, to provide basic infrastructure for project participants without a lot of training and programming in data science, so that these participants could create and interpret topic models themselves. Another way that we adopted an open science framework is through the invention of what we call our interpretation protocol, which was a sort of system that we developed using Qualtrics as our platform. This protocol declares sort of standard instructions and observation steps for researchers using topic models. The goal with the interpretation protocol is not to make interpretations of models fully reproducible, because processes of reading and interpreting are never going to be fully reproducible. This is okay, in our mind, it was okay. And this is really where the art of scholarship, especially for us as humanities scholars and for us as literary scholars, comes in. Really the goal for the interpretation protocol is about documenting observations that have led to interpretations or conclusions. The open science value here is in the documentation. It's the simple idea that we want to document our decisions as we go so that others can understand them later. So in keeping with this goal, the project has produced really like reams and reams and reams of documents. And this proliferation of documentation leads me to the final section of the talk, problems. After a certain point, the question becomes, who will read all of this and why will they read it? We in the project have placed lots of emphasis on making our findings public and on making them as transparent as possible, but to what ends? These questions, for me, raise one of the most vexing issues associated with this kind of work in the humanities and in my particular discipline of literary studies, collaboration and authorship. And so here I'm really pivoting to talk about the ramifications of this kind of work within the academy. There's a large body of research in STS devoted to studying ever-changing practices in scientific authorship. This slide illustrates a topic many scholars have discussed, which are the changing norms surrounding what is sometimes called hyper-authorship, or what happens when hundreds or even thousands of people add their names as authors to a paper. Authorship is at the foundation of so much of what we do in academia, of course, and it underlies much of what passes for judgment concerning how to credential academic workers, whether to hire them and whether to promote them. However, the models of authorship currently in use across much of the humanities, especially again in literary studies, are deeply at odds with the kind of collaborative work that I outlined briefly in the talk's previous section. And here we can see this slide, which is variations of which are often thrown around a lot in outlets like The Economist, which are comparing disciplines, large groups of disciplines, according to the number of co-authors on average in articles. And we can see on the very left here, arts and humanities are the very lowest number of co-authors. The model of authorship currently in operation, or commonly in operation still in literary studies, is based on the notion of the lone individual who conceives of an original idea, puts it down on paper, gets it published in a peer-reviewed venue. This person who does this has produced scholarship and they are an author. Well, this notion is slowly changing in some places, especially if we think about sort of the growing acceptance of more public and publicly oriented writing in the academy. The strange thing to me is that this model remains our standard way of thinking about knowledge production, despite all of the work done in our own discipline that shows that this model of authorship does not correspond to reality, is rooted in deeply problematic masculinist and Eurocentric ideas about selfhood, and works to exclude most people from the profession. So I bring this up not just because I myself am heading into the tenure review process in just like a month, but also because part of the explicit rationale of collaborative projects in the humanities is that they are supposed to help researchers get jobs and then keep those jobs. Therefore, the arguments go, collaborative research experience should be part of a major part of humanist training in the academy. Yet we largely remain confused or conflicted about how to understand and how to credit or to count the massive amount of labor involved in collaborative research and the different skills it cultivates. The issue again that we face in WNS, and this is like my favorite slide for this talk today, especially as we're winding down and wrapping up the funded portion of the project, is simply this: the work of 100 people has gone into every finding or interpretation or conclusion members of the project make, and this labor is absolutely essential to these conclusions. The question is, how can we square this reality with the professional demand for individual authorship? We're trying various ways of balancing this. Just really quickly, I'm going to run through them. The first is what we call our key finding card system, which I think originally was Abigail's idea, which communicates findings to the public through our website through sort of short, easily digestible cards focused on one idea or result. This allows for individuals to publicly track specific contributions they make by authoring specific cards that communicate those contributions. We've also written, well, that's not going to show. Anyway, it's supposed to be a picture here of a bunch of different blog posts from our site. We've written various blog posts and interim and final reports and white papers, which we've posted to our site. Again, this is about communicating our findings to the public. Wow. We also, I'm not sure what's happening. We also are posting our software and data to our GitHub repo. This is supposed to be a picture of our GitHub repo with author names included as part of the repo. And this is sort of also an advertisement for Watch This Space. Our software is going to be coming quite soon. While all of these things are good and they're all important to the funding body, the Mellon, the problem with each is that they're not generally recognized as peer-reviewed or as single authors, products of single authorship, and thus it's unclear how they count in terms of credentialing, hiring, and promoting. And I'll just skip to this slide. Finally, of course, there's the issue of co-authored publications, which I won't even really get into here, and the sort of issue of, again, the issue there becomes how do we count co-authored publications? And the sort of general model that's favored is a co-authored publication counts for a half or a third or a fourth of a regular publication and other such nonsense. So this issue is pressing, and I am winding down now because people's jobs depend to some ultimately unknown extent on the ability of the project to convert collaborative research and labor, the thing you see on this slide, all the things that we did over the course of many years, into credentialing mechanisms that revolve around the concept of the individual author and scholar. I'll just say in closing that this problem is so large because it's structural that all I can do is sort of walk up to it and look over the edge. Many others have done this. I'm certainly not the first person to bring this up. However, to draw attention to this problem is to reiterate, as much scholarship in STS has done, that each disciplinary community has its own norms and procedures regarding authorship. This scholarship has shown how the norms in some fields, such as particle physics, have shifted over time in response to the realities of collaborative work. But it has also shown how some fields have continued to resist such changes. There's some evidence that the discipline of literary studies, at least, might fall into this latter camp, that our response to ever-increasing precarity and reliance on contingent labor will be to double down on models tied to individual authorship rather than to make room for collaborative collective work. I really hope I'm wrong, but STS scholarship can at least remind us that we in the humanities aren't the first to grapple with these questions, and if we're prepared to learn, it may provide us with continued fuel for change. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Lindsay, for that amazing talk. It reminds me of one of the strategies that we used over the summer to make people feel like they were part of one community, even though we were all on Zoom, was you and the other PIs actually sent us all a box of snacks through the mail. And we would get on Zoom together and choose which snack we were going to eat for the day. It was very validating. All right, and just a reminder to folks, please do post questions in the chat as they occur to you. Elizabeth will be helping us grab questions out of the chat so that we can address them later during the Q&A portion. And again, thank you so much, Lindsay, for that wonderful presentation. So next, we will hear from Abigail Droge in her talk titled Reading with Scientists. Dr. Abigail Droge is an ACLS Emerging Voices Fellow in the Department of English at Emory University. She received her PhD from Stanford University in 2018 and subsequently collaborated on the Mellon-funded Digital and Public Humanities Project, What Everyone Says, the Humanities in Public Discourse, which we just heard a bit about, as a postdoctoral scholar at UC Santa Barbara. Her research focuses on the history of reading in 19th century Britain, and her work has appeared or is forthcoming in the Victorian Periodicals Review, the Journal of Literature and Science, and Victorian Studies. She's particularly interested in considering how literature might help us to bridge specialized fields, and her teaching emphasizes connections between academic disciplines, time periods, and reading communities. Thanks very much, Abigail.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Thank you for having me. I'm going to try to share my screen. Is that working? Great.
Yes, you're good.
Well, thank you all so much. Thank you to Rebecca and the organizers for having me. It's just a real pleasure to be here with all of you today. I'm really grateful. So my talk today is called Reading with Scientists. And I'll be thinking about 3 questions. So I'm going to start by turning to the history of reading in 19th century Britain and asking, how can literature shape scientific communities and institutions? Then I'll turn to my role in the collaborative project, What Everyone Says, to think about the current landscape of public discourse around the humanities and the sciences. And then finally, I'll close by asking, how could such research from these first 2 questions inform the decisions that we make in building our own interdisciplinary communities and education systems? So this first question was really top of mind for me as a graduate student. I was doing an English PhD in a Silicon Valley environment that was very science heavy. So this was something that I thought about a lot. And as a Victorian scholar, I became familiar with one of the crucial points in this trajectory of the 2 cultures of the sciences and the humanities, which is this exchange between Matthew Arnold and Thomas Huxley at the end of the 19th century. Thomas Huxley, a follower of Darwin, was a real proponent of scientific education. And he says in his famous essay, Science and Culture, neither the discipline nor the subject matter of classical education, meaning a humanistic education, is of such direct value to the student of physical science as to justify the expenditure of valuable time upon either. So I read this as a graduate student and I thought, well, you know what's really interesting about this is that this essay was originally given as a speech at the opening day of a science college, Mason Science College in 1880 in Birmingham. And this college was a civic college, meaning that its students came from a wide spectrum of socioeconomic backgrounds. It was also co-ed, open to both male and female students in 1880, which is quite remarkable and unusual at the time. And so I thought to myself, you know, I wonder how the students actually felt. I wonder how the students experienced literature or the humanities at this science college. How did it actually play out on the ground in light of this speech that Huxley gives? And so I went to England and I did archival research looking at the history of this college, which later became the University of Birmingham. And what I found was not only were there curricular opportunities to pursue the humanities at Mason Science College, there was an English department, there was Latin and Greek, there was French and German, etc. But also the students themselves were quite quick to diagnose and to criticize what they called these times of specialization and concentration. So the students were witnessing at the end of the 19th century this moment of the birth of disciplines in the way that we think of them now as segmented bureaucratic units in academic institutions. And they were seeing that unfold around them at quite a quick pace. And they saw it as dangerous and as something to be grappled with. And one of the students who articulates this in a really powerful way was named Miss Jessie Edwards. She wrote this essay called The Relationship Between the Social and Intellectual Life of a College. And she writes that our college falls mainly into 2 great divisions, known respectively as the science and arts sides of the college. And she goes on to say that it is of great importance that these various departments should be in some way connected. So the students really took it upon themselves to try to build this community that they didn't see as available to them in a specialized institution. And one of the ways that they did that was by really emphasizing extracurricular activity. So the students came together, they formed a student union, which was an after-class venue for giving papers, having debates, sharing readings, putting on plays, etc. They also ran and published a literary magazine, the Mason College Magazine, which often had discussions of literature. And so they talked about a range of subjects, but literature really was a central component for making this community. And one of the favorite authors of the students, to my great delight to find this, was George Eliot. George Eliot was the favorite novelist. The students vote on their favorite books. George Eliot wins far and away. They write essays about her in the magazine. They give readings of her work. They have debates about whether she's better than Jane Austen. They just love her. And so literature, in this case, can be a way for students outside of class to form connections that are not available to them in the curriculum. And the faculty at Mason Science College were also really keen to recognize the value of this kind of extracurricular activity. So here's one passage from a professor saying, "The work of the class and laboratory must have its complement in a vigorous college life outside the lecture rooms. Now that specialization begins so early, it is more than ever important that students studying in different branches should come into contact with each other." I really want to focus on this phrase, outside the lecture rooms. And I have a couple of takeaways here. So the first takeaway from this research is that literature can be a means for establishing community amidst a culture of specialization. That's really great. There's something really great about the fact that George Eliot can be a kind of common ground for students across different fields. But I think it's really important to focus on that aspect that this solution is happening outside the lecture rooms. Therefore, this extracurricular community can also allow specialization to continue by leaving the segmented institution unchanged and intact. So in other words, because students can come together outside of class, they don't have to come together inside class. So the class curricular structure of having specialized disciplines doesn't change. That remains and stays still specialized. So I think that one of the key questions that this kind of an example can raise for us, especially in building interdisciplinary communities like STS and like the digital humanities, is how do we navigate, how do we see ourselves as an interdisciplinary community in relation to a larger specialized academic structure? What role do we see our work as playing in potentially trying to alter that structure in some way? I'm going to jump forward now and turn now to my work with the What Everyone Says project to think about the current landscape of public discourse around the humanities and the sciences. So my role in the highly collaborative What Everyone Says project that Lindsay was just describing was to lead the team called the Curriculum Lab, which was a team that was focused on student experiences of the humanities in higher education. These are some of the team members here, including Rebecca herself. So that's really wonderful. And we were interested in thinking about the student experience of the humanities, first of all, at a big data scale. So we had a collection of about 21,000 articles from student newspapers from about 600 campuses across the US that included the words humanities or liberal arts from about the last 15 years or so. And we might expect that articles containing the word humanities might have some kind of antagonistic relationship with science, potentially, but we didn't see this to be the case. We saw that student journalists were very positive about the opportunities for interdisciplinary collaboration between the sciences and the humanities. So for example, these are some articles in a topic that emerged for us about medical education, where we saw that students were writing about reforming medical education to include the humanities. They were writing about professors discussing the relationship between medicine and the arts, thinking about doctors embracing patients' backgrounds, etc. So just really emphasizing these positive opportunities for interdisciplinary exchange. Jumping to another thread of the project, which is actually a piece that Lindsay and I are co-authoring, again, this question of co-authorship. We are looking at articles both from student newspapers and from top circulating US newspapers like the New York Times, the Washington Post, etc. And we have articles that are about the humanities and articles that are about the sciences. And we're trying to understand how these two kinds of discourse are in relation to each other. And one thing that we find is that there's quite a large difference between how the humanities are communicated in public discourse and how the sciences are communicated. For the humanities, articles often follow a pattern of what we might call double communication. So the article itself is about an act of communication already, an event, a class, a panel, a festival, etc., which means that there's already an embedded audience within that article. So the people who came to the event or the students who are sitting in the classroom, for example. And then that act of communication is being communicated again in the article to the reading public, the audience that's going to read that article. So we have this kind of double layering here. In contrast, we see that science articles often follow a more, what we might think of as a more straightforward single layer of communication. The presentation of research findings, for example, headlines like studies show XYZ or researchers find such and such. So to give an example of this, this is a topic that emerged for us about literature in the topic model that we were looking at. And you can see that the headlines of some of the articles associated with this topic are a visiting poet performing, a poet's campus visit, a poetry reading. So people reading these articles are reading about a reading. Again, there's a double layer of communication that's happening. As opposed to the sciences, here is a topic about neuroscience. And articles here are follow a headline structure like university researchers uncover new structures in mouse brains, or UA researchers study how rats make decisions. So here we have a more kind of straight line between the research and the communication, which raises the question for us of what could one model of communication learn from the other? Are there ways that we could communicate humanities research in ways that sciences are communicating? And are there ways that sciences could communicate in the way that the humanities is? So we can begin to ask some of these questions by laying out these landscapes that we see. To complement our big data research, another aspect that we did, which Lindsay mentioned, was to do ethnographic human subjects research, which means that we wanted to talk to real people in our own communities. And we were really interested in how people were experiencing the humanities at our own campuses of UC Santa Barbara and the University of Miami. So at UCSB, we surveyed about 200 members of our campus community, and we held focus groups where we actually talked to people about how they experienced the humanities. And this allowed us to include perspectives that were not well represented in our existing corpus, which was really important to us. So voices of first-generation college students, for example. And we found many things, but I'll just highlight this finding, that it seemed as though the major structure itself presented a barrier to student engagement with the humanities, leading students to try to exceed that structure. So when we asked the question, for example, in a survey, would you advise a friend to major in the humanities? People were very non-committal. Only 28% of people said yes. Most people said that it depends. But then when we asked, would you advise a friend to take part in extracurricular clubs or hobbies oriented around the humanities? Nobody said no, and the overwhelming majority say yes. So what this leads us to believe is that there's quite a lot of enthusiasm about the humanities. The trip up comes when students feel themselves hemmed in by the institutional structures that they encounter in terms of expressing that enthusiasm for the humanities. So in a similar way to what we saw with Mason Science College, where students felt the strictures of a specialized curriculum and sought to exceed that curriculum by going to the extracurricular sphere, students now are doing a similar thing where they're seeking out experiences with other disciplines extracurricularly. But what that can do, or the risk that we need to be aware of, is that it leaves the curricular specialized. Okay, so now, based on all of that research, how could the two sections that I've just described inform the decisions that we make in building our own interdisciplinary communities and education systems? How could we move forward? I'm going to propose three possible ways forward. The first is to be intentional about the kinds of extracurricular opportunities that we create. So we try to do this in the What Everyone Says project. one of the questions in our survey of human subjects research was about stereotypes. We asked students if they felt that others had preconceived ideas about them based on their majors. Most people say yes, but they're less likely to say that they judge others based on their majors. So we took from this that students are twice as likely to think that others stereotype them than that they stereotype others. And this leads to what Rebecca very eloquently called a discourse desert, where there's not a lot of communication happening between students of different fields. They feel isolated and tend to feel territorial. And one thing that we might attribute this to is that there seems to be a risk of students mistaking institutional barriers, meaning a lack of opportunity to talk to people from other fields, for example. They mistake that institutional barrier for an emotional barrier, for thinking, oh, they wouldn't care, or my friends from other fields don't get what I do, nobody understands, that kind of thing. So our question was, how could we ameliorate this? How could we create an extracurricular activity or space for increasing these kinds of opportunities of communication across fields? And one solution that we came up with was to host an event led by two of our fantastic undergraduate research assistants in the project, Helen and Jessica. And they assembled a panel of their peers and had those peers talk to each other across majors about their experiences, about stereotypes they had encountered. And we saw that students recognized in a really powerful way that they shared things, they shared experiences with people in fields that they had initially maybe thought themselves distant from. And I think one reason why this was successful is that we were trying to position humanities advocacy not as advocacy against something else. So we weren't trying to say, be a humanist, don't be a scientist. But instead, we were trying to position it within an interdisciplinary ecosystem where the most important thing was communication. So that's one extracurricular path. I think it's also really important to bring interdisciplinary engagement into the classroom. And this is something that I've been privileged to be able to do in conjunction with the What Everyone Says project in my teaching and the UCSB English department. So one class that I wanted to focus on is called Reading with Scientists. This is the course description here. And broadly, the course paired literary texts and scientific texts with across different fields. So things like artificial intelligence, medicine, environmental conservation, driverless cars, genetic engineering, etc. And paired these texts and tried to ask the question, how could literature help us to think through scientific problems? And then vice versa, how could thinking through scientific problems change our experience of the literature? So really trying to get this back and forth mutual relationship here. And one assignment that I had for the students was to design a lesson plan for teaching literature in a non-literary setting. And the students were so creative. So I'll just share a couple of examples that teams came up with. One team wanted to teach Alice's Adventures in Wonderland to help chemistry and biology students address the ethics of using psychedelic drugs as patient therapy. Another team wanted to teach Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, which is a text that deals heavily with death, to help pre-med students address end-of-life experiences with empathy. And the examples went on and on. So it was very exciting to pose this question to students and to see how excited they were to really question some of these barriers and think about ways to cross disciplines in this way. And this experience of teaching this class and also of working on the What Everyone Says project and my own dissertation and book research has led me to think about larger academic and corporate structures. So I think the problem can be summed up in this way. So if you're trying to get a job at Facebook, Facebook should care that its employees have read a Dickens novel. And the way that we usually talk about the humanities when we're talking about job preparation is through skills. We talk about critical thinking, often without defining what that is. We talk about research skills. We talk about writing and communicating. All of those things are fantastic and valuable and really important. But I think what we need is a much more robust vocabulary and way of describing the specific historical and narrative knowledge that you get from studying the humanities, and how that historical and narrative knowledge could be applicable in a career path in the science and tech field. So if you've read a Dickens novel, for example, you know about the Industrial Revolution. You know about how a new technology can have socioeconomic impacts in an urban environment, and especially for vulnerable populations. All of these things are central to what is happening in the tech industry right now and what's happening in Silicon Valley. So this kind of knowledge should be crucial if you're going to be working in a tech startup making an app. So I think we need ways of articulating for ourselves how we can transfer the insights, particularly of interdisciplinary fields like digital humanities and STS, into the corporate workplace for science and tech careers. If you have a student who's done digital humanities work, what do you want them to do differently in that tech job than maybe a student would who didn't have that kind of educational experience? I think collectively, we could do a lot to articulate what we see as these kinds of impacts. So this has led me, this is my final point, to a passion project of mine that I'm trying to get off the ground. It's still very much in development. A website called Reading With, Building Bridges with Books. This is the URL here. There's a lot of blanks and holes, but do check it out if you're interested. And the idea is that you could fill in the blank with any number of audiences. So reading with biologists, reading with computer scientists, reading with economists, engineers, entrepreneurs, medical professionals, etc. And really using literature and other texts as ways of asking these questions and building conversations around key issues like artificial intelligence, economic inequality, driverless cars, etc. And thinking about ways that we could provide specific texts and resources for building this kind of common ground. How could, for example, a George Eliot novel, which we saw as providing space for these kinds of conversations in the 19th century, how might we use that novel now to, say, provide common ground for specialized communities to talk to each other, either within academia or between academia and a larger public? So these are the questions that I'm thinking about. I'm thrilled to be thinking about them with all of you, and I really look forward to the discussion, and thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Abigail, for an excellent presentation. You have just the coolest course design ever, seriously. Excellent. So next up, we're going to hear from Nikki Renburg from UCSB, presenting Alone, I Am Just One Tree, Community Science in the Archangel Tree Archive. Nikki Renburg is a UCSB graduate student in history, studying 19th and 20th century environmental public histories. Her dissertation explores the development of national and state parks in California, particularly focusing on the areas surrounding Sequoia National Park and Redwood National and State Parks. She works on the History and Relevancy Project with the California State Parks Service, researching and creating public tours of Carpinteria State Beach and, since COVID-19, a virtual field trip week-long event with the Santa Barbara Trust for Historic Preservation for the Santa Barbara junior high schoolers. Please join me in welcoming Nikki and her amazing talk.
Hi, everyone. Let me just get my PowerPoint up. So let me start this up. So yeah, hi everyone. My name is Nikki Renburg. Like Rebecca said, I also want to thank Rebecca and everyone so much for inviting me here. I am so excited to be in community with you and share my thoughts on how we bridge these two cultures, or are there even more than two? We will get into it. So today I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I work towards bridging the two cultures. in both my public history research and praxis. So my title here refers to an article that I'm working on regarding community science, but I think when we're talking about bridging or connecting to broader publics, we need to ensure that the history and the stakes of that work, as well as constantly reinvestigating and reconfiguring best practices in doing so. Also, as a side note, I will be using publics rather than public talking here, because I think it's really important to emphasize that there are multiple publics with whom we can and we should work. So before I get too ahead of myself, I'm a PhD student at UCSB, located on unceded Chumash land. I'm currently presenting to you from my home on Tongva land. The Chumash and Tongva are the traditional custodians of these lands, and I pay much respect to the Chumash and Tongva elders of the past, present, and future. So a little bit about me, I'll tell you how I got into this topic. So I came to this kind of weird. So I am a public historian, but in my past life, I was an English graduate student studying James Joyce and comic books. So if you ever want to get weird with modernism and comic books, I am your girl. But through that process, I fell in love with tutoring and teaching writing during that time. And that was really my first experience with working with publics. As kind of a side note, I think I'm really excited to hear more about thinking about teaching as a way to bridge between different disciplines and discourses. I don't, at least in a lot of my circles in the department, we don't always focus on that. I really think we should. Anywho, lost my thought. So, you know, through that experience, teachers and especially tutors operate kind of in this liminal space that helps guide, mentor, and give tools to do more research, for students to do more research. Around the same time, I also developed a deep love for national parks, and I wanted to study the history of how different publics have gotten to know public lands and how that has changed over time. So I was fortunate enough to get a National Council of Preservation Education internship at Redwood National Park, and it basically changed my life. I was able to see kind of how the sausage gets made, so to speak, behind the scenes of cultural resource management in a bigger federal agency. While I did not work directly with the publics at the time, I wrote reports that rangers would use to shape their walking tours and campfire talks. I already had aspirations to become a park ranger, and this basically sealed the deal for me. When I returned from that internship, I was a Mellon Sawyer Energy Justice in the Global Perspective Fellowship recipient, which put me in conversation with great folks who do energy and environmental justice on and off campus. And through that project, I worked to create and present a tour of UCSB's Natural Reserve Coal Oil Point, which became an online field guide to oil in Santa Barbara. That's on Scalar. You can look it up. I can put it in the chat if anybody's interested. And we launched that for the 50th anniversary of the Santa Barbara oil spill that occurred in 1969. So this, like Rebecca said, led to my further interest in public history, and I began working with the History and Relevancy program that my department does with the California State Park System. And like she said earlier, I worked with Carpenter State Beach, giving tours on anything from environmental, local history, women's history, history of science. It was really fun before COVID happened, and now I give virtual field trips online. So all of these experiences emphasized for me the importance of collaborating with multiple interest and sometimes, frankly, disinterest groups, learning local history and community members and stories, working towards accessibility, not only intellectually, but physically, if I'm giving tours, and finally, explaining the stakes of work clearly, concisely, and with respect. So very quick, a definition of environmental public history. I like to think of this as simply public history outside. Public history is a study of history and methodology of engaging publics with historical narratives. So while a not insignificant amount of public historians do their work for national and state parks or on other sites that curate and interpret natural, in scare quotes, or built environments, not all public historians are as enthusiastic to get an NPS issued Stetson hat or a Cal Parks volunteer vest as I am. So environmental public history, in my view, is the merging of the history of science and public history. Their shared history is one thing that brings them together, and some of the earliest examples that we can see are in natural history museums. To the left, you can see the Natural History Museum, the American Natural History Museum in New York City. So this began naturally with natural history museums who collected specimens, primarily floral, until the mid-19th century. And then they started to get more faunal, as you can see in my picture. These collections helped create a community for natural philosophers and natural historians, who would later be called naturalists, and even more later, a bevy of other titles ranging from botanist to zoologist, to categorize and better understand what they considered the book of nature. This shared knowledge, albeit of mostly elite European men, could be considered a prototype for shared authority, which is a public historical idea of working with publics to create knowledge together. I think this becomes more clear in community science, but here we can see a seed of it happening. Naturalists would work together to perform Linnaean classification, and this work was later reified in how natural collections were archived that impacted future research, and then was later presented to professional and then even later broader publics. These collections, while it has to be kind of reiterated, were created by elites using the transatlantic slave trade to collect specimens, have contributed to the continued work of creating reliable knowledge about the natural world or science. In particular, these collections are still used to benefit work in biology and other environmental and ecological sciences today. So besides the shared history, and maybe even more importantly, it is also the continued work on considering the material presentation of natural sites in natural history museums, observatories, botanical gardens, and state and national parks, where what I would consider a lot of magic happens. In these sites, the book of nature, as naturalists once called it, is now made legible as children and adults alike gather around specimens, cataloged and interpreted for them to better understand the world around them. In state and national parks, there is usually interpretive signage, following trails or explained on trail maps. And sometimes these sites also have natural history museums and their own visitor centers. So for me personally, it was visiting both of these sites that captured my imagination as a child. And I really think it's the larger experience as a public historian, a public history practitioner now, that really makes these places so truly magical. It's pieces of the past mixing with the present and creating new imaginaries for visitors, new ways of thinking about the world. They allow visitors to both connect to the past, but also to connect with environmental or natural science, and the science production. So I think this is especially true of younger visitors, and why it is so important for them to have access to these sites as part of the process of their learning and growth. So I think this magic also continues when parks and museums have scientists doing work on site, and we see this a lot in both natural history museums and parks. Some, like the Los Angeles Museum of Natural History, have windows in their laboratory where visitors can look in and see science happen. Some park museums may have the same feature as well in their visitor center, but also scientists can be spotted in the wild, similarly to any other charismatic megafauna. These sightings illustrate that these sites are what Robert Kohler calls labscapes, or laboratory spaces that have been renaturalized, where scientific work is brought outside, back into nature. These attributions highlight the shared past of both history of science and public history, and truly what makes the field of environmental history, again, just from my point of view. And I think that this really becomes truly useful when we think about bridging two or even multiple cultures, when these labscapes also allow for community science to happen. So community science can also be called citizen science. You can see at the bottom, this is a picture from citizenscience.org, and so this is seen as a collaboration between scientists and those who are curious about it to create reliable knowledge about how the world works. I personally prefer the term community science because it emphasizes working together, focusing less on generating data only for scientific analysis and more on generating knowledge that is useful for sustaining communities, both in the short term for communities of interest and also in the long term for human survival. It can have a lot of appearances, I think, but it easily, at least in my view and experience, ties very closely with environmental public history work. So one example that I'm currently researching that gets into this environmental public history and community science is the Archangel Ancient Tree Archive, which seeks to propagate and plant tree species that are successful at mitigating climate change through storing carbon. Two species of high interest for them are giant sequoias and especially coast redwoods. They create both living archives of ancient tree clones by planting them, but also create digitized archives of genetic information of the trees, emphasizing the traits that make them so successful as fighters of climate change. So this is important work for a few reasons, but a major one is that we have cut down over 98% of all coast redwoods since 1850. Some very fast facts about redwoods. If you know me, you know that I can go on and on about them. So just briefly, redwoods are part of the cypress family. They have been around on this planet since the Jurassic period, covering the northwestern quadrant of the continent. They now only grow 20 miles from the California coast between Santa Cruz and Southern Oregon, and they can be over 2,000 years old and 400 feet tall, making them the tallest trees in the world. They have really fine grains, and they are basically impervious to fire and rot, which makes them an excellent building material and one that was used in insane amounts in the 19th and 20th centuries. So you can see here in 1850, it would take about 7 to 10 men to cut down one tree in a week. As science improved and changed, modernization, industrialization, capitalism made it possible for redwoods to basically build California. So, for example, nearly all of San Francisco's infrastructure in the late 19th and early 20th century was all made out of redwoods. So I'm talking about houses, wharves, sidewalks, piers, the ferry building, trolleys, even their pipes were made out of redwood. And then, if you know California history, that city caught on fire a couple times and they would just rebuild it again. Since starting in 1890 and really reaching its stride in 1920 with the creation of the Save the Redwoods League, there's been much redwood activism, which arguably I think could really be considered a part of environmental public history, advocating for science and research and trees to continue, because yeah, without the trees, how can we have tree science? But I'm getting ahead of myself. And I mean, this has continued even till today. So you can see here in the 80s and 90s with my newspaper clipping, and in the 1990s, community member Julia Butterfly Hill tree sat in her favorite tree, Luna. And redwood activism continues today. Whenever I do field work or archival work and I am in Humboldt County, I will always see Trees Equal Life. Folks are still trying to shut down local logging mills because there are groves of redwoods that are still up for cutting. So with all of this being said, with all of the damage to redwoods that has already been wrought, the Archangel Ancient Tree Archive is really trying to propagate propagators, because of the hole that all of this logging has left, not just in our forests and our hearts, but also in our carbon storage. They're working with communities to educate them on coast redwoods and their ecosystems, while also working on cloning trees and creating digital archives of some of the oldest, and so by their understanding, most resilient of the species. They work with volunteers to collect cloning material and also plant, which is in their words, propagating the propagators. Their work is important, not just because it helps with carbon storage through using charismatic megaflora to do so, but also because it gets the public involved. It gives them information. It gives them tools. It makes aspects of anthropogenic climate change more easy to understand while giving them something to do about it, besides the classic reduce, reuse, recycle. So in conclusion, how do we bridge the two cultures? I say we do so with 3 considerations, and I ask for your forgiveness because they are all tree puns. So firstly, we need to remember our roots. While much of what we do is considered science or professional science, and this was all done by elite European men, it was also done in conjunction with lots of communities and publics, culminating in museums that work towards making science and its history more legible. But we cannot stop there. We must also remember to keep branching out and to connect and collaborate not only with other disciplines and other ways of thinking and knowing. I'm thinking especially of Indigenous knowledge and cosmology systems. And we must engage with the publics. We must work with them when we can and find ways that the knowledge we create does not just begin and end with us. And finally, we must love the forest. We must not only focus on one tree, we must consider the bigger picture, the bigger stakes of our work, and the necessity to continue towards bridging the cultures. Because while I can only say this for myself, and I hope this may be true for some of you folks as well, alone, I am just one tree. And I need you, and I need the rest of the forest to survive. So thank you so much. And I'm really looking forward to questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Nikki. That's such fascinating work that you're doing. And as a grad student myself, I'm always inspired when I see other grad students doing real things in the real world that help real people. So that's just fantastic.
We're also doing real things because we are here, but besides the point.
That's true, but it can be very isolated. Excellent. And just a reminder for those of you who are recent arrivals, go ahead and put questions in the chat. We already have a number of them, and we're just gathering them as they come and trying to make sure that we will address them in the second part of this talk. And finally, we're fortunate to hear from Kalindi Vora and Sarah McCullough, the Director and Associate Director of UC Davis's Feminist Research Institute. Their talk is titled The Science We Are For, Feminist Anti-Racist STS Approaches to STEM Research. I will introduce them each in turn. Kalindi Vora is Professor of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies and Director of the Feminist Research Institute at UC Davis. She's the author of Surrogate Humanity, Race, Robotics, and the Politics of Technological Futures, published with Duke University Press in 2019 and co-authored with Netta Atanisowski. She's also author of Life Support, Biocapital and the New History of Outsourced Labor, published in 2015 and recipient of the Rachel Carson Book Prize in 2018. And is one of the authors of the multigraph Techno-Precarious, published in 2020. She's published numerous ethnographic articles about gestational surrogates in India, appearing in journals such as Ethnos, Journal of Anthropology, Current Anthropology, Social Identities, the South Atlantic Quarterly, and Catalyst, Feminism, Theory, and Technoscience. Dr. Sarah McCullough is the Associate Director of the Feminist Research Institute. She is co-PI on an NSF study that integrates justice-oriented frameworks from STS and ethnic studies into STEM graduate education. She participates in a multiracial collective of transportation professionals dedicated to mobility justice and is the founder of the Mobility Justice Research Network. She applies her expertise in ethnographic methods, discourse and power analysis, and science and technology studies to create research partnerships between social science and humanities scholars, STEM researchers, and community partners. She earned her PhD in cultural studies with a DE in feminist theory and research at UC Davis. Please join me in welcoming our last but not least final very exciting panel.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. I wanted to thank the organizers for inviting us, and also the presenters that have gone before us for sharing their important work. Today, I'm going to introduce a few collaborative projects I'm involved in that take scholarship in feminist theory, critical race and ethnic studies, and STS to create interventions intended to help technoscience practitioners develop awareness and practices that account for historical injustices. So even before COVID-19, it was obvious to many of us that we need new ways to enrich our technological imaginaries by thinking about them through these histories. So my current work asks, what other possible forms of sociality, care, and relation can we open up through rethinking technoscience infrastructure from a perspective that is feminist, anti-racist, and informed by STS? So to give you a sense of my background and approach to this problem, my first two books, Life Support and Surrogate Humanity, the second was written with Nina Tanasowski, look at imaginaries of both radical change and human futurity that are implicit in the design of new technologies, and considers alternatives to these to ask, how do we work with the world that we have, given its historical roots in colonial science and given our limited models for sustainable relations of care? How do we forward something different? And I'll talk about the third book on this slide, Techno-Precarious, briefly in just a moment. So in the last 5 years, I've moved some of my research agenda to trying to impact STEM fields directly, participating in social change-oriented STEM-facing projects through collaborative groups that bring together expertise in feminist research and ethnic and community histories with technical expertise. So for example, I'm one of a team of 11 authors who've published this book manuscript titled Techno-Precarious. And here on the slide, you see several of us working furiously with many, many Post-it notes on the book project. And that book includes a chapter on care as a political methodology. Based on the University of Michigan's Precarity Lab, the book was actually funded by an initiative to see what happens when the university gives science kind of funding to the humanities. So that's interesting for this conversation. The book aims to show the intensification of depletion economies that has occurred through digital technologies, while also attending to ways that people have organized against and resisted that depletion. So topics include extraction economies, the failures of mainstream medicine to meet trans health needs, the negative impacts of the automation of Medicaid and Medicare, and other topics. As another example, as the convener of a 10-week residential research group at UCHRI, I got to work with a group of social scientists who study science and technology and also collaborate with scientists in our own research work. And so the names of that group are here on this slide. And what we've done is we've done several things out of this group. And one of those is to put together a book manuscript that's meant to reach practitioners in STEM, as well as students, as well as people with a general interest. And the book is imagined as a pocket guide. So something that you would take with you in the field and would guide you towards an ethics of practice that will be informed by feminist and anti-racist principles. So this slide features a section of one chapter called Care, the only carry-on you'll need for your journey. And it raises the question that we strive to answer in this book, which is, what does it mean to tread carefully as a researcher or a scientist? And actually the title for today's talk is taken from the title of this book, which is The Science We Are For, a Pocket Guide. And the book is written as a short introduction to the problems of non-feminist approaches to science, as well as providing some entry-level tools for feminist and anti-racist practice. Care and research is one of our central analytics. The tone is meant to be a bit light and fun, so a variety of readers can be engaged, and hence the idea of the pocket guide to be used in the field, so to speak. Another example that illustrates how we present STS concepts to that imagined audience is here in this entry on aggressive objectivity. I'll read a bit out of the excerpt from the pocket guide. So it says, aggressive objectivity. Imperialistic science is in a moment of crisis. On the one hand, there is an increasing pressure on scientists to consider social impact and make their work more responsive to communities. On the other hand, the notion of a politically engaged or politically informed science as being non-objective and therefore making the scientific enterprise seem illegitimate is still deeply ingrained in scientific practice. Aggressive objectivity means that the person doing the research is unaccounted for, a voice from nowhere and everywhere. Rather, we view aggressive objectivity as a form of what Donna Haraway calls partial perspectives, see glossary. It's a feeling that we can know and master everything around us if we just set the conditions for objectivity, conditions that are, of course, only available to some. So you see, so I hope you can see here how we've presented two foundational concepts from feminist STS, that is partial perspectives and situated knowledge, all under the critique of the imperial history that plays out in the ongoing philosophy and practices of science. Oops. So three members of this group that was on the slide previously, Saiba, Varma, Salzarate, and myself, have also put together a program we're trying to fund that will train humanities PhD students who want to bring critical race and gender studies informed STS to healthcare practice. And we hope that this would make them employable by community organizations and medical institutions who want to address racial justice in healthcare. And I can talk about this idea more in the Q&A. Over the course of 3 years, we've proposed to work with community health organizations and medical institutions to develop a curriculum towards this end. The structure of that curriculum would be informed by the results of the next project I want to introduce. So as a co-PI with Dr. Sarah McCullough, we're running a 3-year National Science Foundation funded program to develop new curricula to train PhD students in engineering and the sciences to incorporate knowledge of historical injustice and exclusions into their own research, design, and practice. And this is so that they can imagine what kind of research approaches and practices we can build to enable a different future. So this is the visions of feminist science. And this image actually comes out of one of the working group exercises that Sarah did with participants in year 1 of our planning process. So based on that year-long working group process and advisory board feedback, we've designed and implemented the curriculum for the past 2 years. To build a larger conversation around this research, we've organized open calls for papers at the 4S meetings for the last 2 years, and we now have over 60 people who are involved internationally. And one of them, Anita Se-Chan, is advocating to even propose a subcommittee within the 4S dedicated to feminist STEM pedagogy. So our curriculum is designed to be shared through several vehicles, including a graduate seminar, which I'm teaching right now for the 2nd year. And some of those current seminar participants are here in the audience, so perhaps we'll want to engage their experiences during discussion. By the end of the seminar, each student designs a teach-back module for their own field of research. Those modules are based on another curriculum vehicle, which is a set of 8 one-hour-long modules, which Sarah is here to talk about next. So to sum up, these are all projects informed by critical race and gender studies and STS scholarship that aim to make direct interventions in technoscience practice, either through engaging practitioners through their readership or through pedagogy and curriculum. So now I'll hand things over to Sarah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kalindi. I will go ahead and share my slides now. One moment. Sorry, having trouble finding what I need. Here we go. Oops. Okay. You know, as Kalindi said, this is a project that you know, I've been putting a lot of time into at the Feminist Research Institute. And I want to share a little bit about the origins that I think, you know, you can identify with. When I came into this position, one of the mandates that UC Davis had given the Feminist Research Institute was to support feminist research where it has its strongholds in social sciences and humanities, but also to expand its impact to STEM fields. And so I started talking with a lot of, you know, STEM faculty in that, and, you know, I had some very strange conversations. And I realized that I needed to do some work, like some training to create some common ground, that actually, like, to do this on the kind of scale that, you know, we wanted to envision, like required some training. And so we, you know, went to work and started this Asking Different Questions program. It was inspired by a lot of the work of so many feminist STS scholars. And I want to, you know, shout out specifically to Debelina's Roy's essay and her whole body of work, but that, you know, we drew the specific title from this project for. Originally, this project was a project started by myself and Sarah Giordano and Kalindi Vora. And my piece in it has been to create these 1 hour short little snippets, you could say, of STS or critical race theory knowledge that is directly applied to scientific contexts. And we launched it large scale this fall with the Asking Different Questions Scholars Program. At that event, at that series, it was essentially ran through the fall quarter. We had 40 graduate students participate from around 75 that applied. And we also opened up part of that program to the general public, and we had 75 to 100 people attending on average. I also have here a session we did on addressing privilege and anti-Blackness in research culture. We've done 2 versions of that now that are related but separate, and we've had 200 people attend each of those. So we've had a pretty large audience, a larger audience than I had anticipated when we began. And the feedback for this has been, you know, really exciting too. We've had, you know, 89% say they plan on taking action after they attend. Most say they would recommend them. And after the first 2 sessions, we asked people like, hey, are you going to come back? And literally everyone said yes. The fields that are attending are also really, really diverse. This is a division across the different colleges and schools at UC Davis. You can see virtually every college and school is represented here. We didn't advertise these with the School of Medicine, but we are working with them on doing separate related work now. And so what kind of stuff are we talking about? We were talking about these sorts of questions that what you're seeing here is kind of like how work is translated. So the question of what have research had to give up to be a part of the science community, you know, is about like, you know, positionality. And specifically, we drew on Bano Subramaniam's work, her essay on Snow Brown and the 7 Detergents, which talks about the exclusionary culture of science. In another session, we talk about the legacies of colonialism in science. And there we use the work of Indigenous scholars doing things like calling on the limitations of a traditional sort of scientific approach to plant sciences, or say the controversy around the building of the Mauna Kea telescope and much of the work that Native American studies scholars have done, as well as Indigenous scientists have written. And, you know, we also look at some, you know, kind of tried and true STS work, such as how language is present within, how language is already putting assumptions into our work. I'm sure a lot of you know the, you know, well-worn territory of Emily Martin's Egg and Sperm essay. And we sort of expand on that in that unit to talk about a lot of other examples. There's also a unit that does sort of like a objectivity takedown a la Donna Haraway style. But in all of these units, they're all theory based, but we're not teaching people theory, we're teaching the application. And so, you know, the reason I think these are working are in part because, you know, we have this foundation of feminist STS, ethnic studies, indigenous studies. Then we're using a feminist pedagogical approach that is valuing everyone in the room's lived experience as expertise. The majority of people who are attending these do identify as underrepresented in their field, and we are letting them self-identify that way. And the other piece that I realized is really crucial to this is also working to give them a sense of what collective organization means. That they're not alone in this, that they can actually organize together, that perhaps, you know, we can begin to give them some of the tools of movement work. And you can see that how this is reflected sort of like in the format of each session. So each session we start out by sharing a foundational topic. So, you know, say it may be settler colonialism and indigenous science as two key terms, or intersectionality. And all of these terms we would know have layers and layers and, you know, volumes of research beneath them. But I just sort of give them this, you know, this sort of bookmark for that, a bookmark that is supported by various references that are provided after the session. But what we spend most of our time on is a case study or some illustrative example that they can hold on to and say, okay, here's something that I can relate to. Here's something specific, something applied. And this first half lasts about less than a half hour. And then the second half of that half hour is facilitate discussions that are led by trained graduate students. We've had majority graduate students who are trained in feminist science and technology studies leading these discussions of their peers, which has been a really successful model. I mean, frankly, given the evaluations, I feel like they did a better job than I did. I facilitated some too. So that was really awesome to see. And we're still going through a lot of the results from this first session that we did in the fall. We're seeing that the impacts of this, I'll read this quote. This is just one example that I thought was pretty cool. This person said, I think it should be a required core curriculum for all researchers and scientists. The false notion of objectivity in science and the lack of contextualization and considerations of power dynamics within my field make it difficult for me to trust what we can use the research for, positive transformational change. ADQ trainings give me tools and a lens that can help me in revisioning, imagining a different way to ask questions and collaborate. And we also saw people come up with tangible next steps based on what they learned. So, you know, for example, they may think about revising their teaching. So this person said, I will be revising the lectures on historical microbiology to include more information about indigenous science erasure and to make the perspective less Eurocentric. Very specific, I love that. And someone else said, I would like to apply these frameworks to my teaching of science, particularly those from making more accurate knowledge, which was a session that was essentially Haraway in mini, and addressing colonialism in science. I want to begin by incorporating the frameworks of perspective as opposed to objectivity and indigenous knowledge into the syllabus and discussion sections. So, you know, it had these really wonderful impacts, and we're going to be doing this again in the spring. I'll be putting out announcements soon for a new group, and it is open. You know, it's open to all disciplines. We did have people from, you know, social sciences and humanities, definitely from the STS fields. But we're still, you know, I wanted to kind of share also some of the challenges we're having going forward. One of those challenges is how do we maintain this community of support over time? because this had a big impact on a lot of the participants. They were talking about things that they'd sort of thought about, like in the silence of their own head, or maybe but they hadn't actually had rigorous conversations with others about. And at the end of the quarter, they wanted more, like they wanted to keep talking, but the program sort of, ended. And so, that's one thing, we're thinking about is like, how can we help to address that? The other challenge we're having is we're seeing more and more demand for this training. So, we're currently working with different departments to do it for their department, particularly a particular program. And many people are also interested in customizing it. So they were like, yes, okay, can we do this, but can we do it just for climate science? Something like that. And the final challenge, and I think this is something, I want to, particularly bring to you all is, they get to that step of like, okay, what's next? Like, yes, I'm going to change how I teach. Okay, I'm going to look for a more diverse data set or develop a more diverse data set. But like, they also just want to do the work differently, and they need new partners to do that. I feel like they're going to need like people who are the experts in science and technology studies to make the things that they now can see could be possible, but they may face significant resistance in their discipline, and they may not know, they need more expertise that I believe science and technology studies has like a richness of to help them meet some of those challenges. So so I just kind of throw that out as some thoughts for you all, and I'm happy to talk about any of this more. And I didn't say this at the beginning, but thank you so much for including us. And it's been really awesome to hear about these amazing other projects that that people are working on. I'm so happy to know about them. So thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. It's really heartening to see how much interest in the cultural aspects of science and how we can work toward making the practice of science less racist, Eurocentric, and more feminist, and to see how much interest is coming from STEM fields themselves. That's just amazing work that you're doing. All right, folks, so we have just a little over 20 minutes for Q&A. We've been gathering questions as we go. And so I'm going to go ahead and begin facilitating that. But I would also like to encourage panelists to ask one another questions, if that is the case, because I imagine that we have a number of questions for one another. So first off, we have a question from Melina, and this, I believe, is geared toward Lindsay, but I think that you all can speak to it to some extent should you so choose. Do physical and natural scientists also count co-authored papers as less than single-authored papers? It seems to me, she continues as context, that all of their journal publications are co-authored. And are there some models there for how social science and humanities disciplines might revalue co-authorship? Is there some model that we can look at in that regard?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, you're correct. There are a lot of models. A lot of the, well, each discipline is different, first of all, but, and I'm not a physical or natural scientist, but I do know that in many fields, for instance, sort of organizing bodies and or journals or consortiums will set sort of regulations or guidelines regarding what authorship is and who counts as an author. And so, for instance, in particle physics, which is just the example that I know from reading a lot of history of science, because of the restraints of that field, meaning you have to work with large pieces of equipment that only exist in very few locations, there's a whole sort of system of authorship that's been developed that has to do with the amount of time you spend at facilities, and sort of what specifically your work is there, but also it's really like you have to be there working for a year. working for X number of hours per week at the facility. And then after you leave, you have authorship privileges for a year. So there are lots of different models that we could look to for sure. And I think, you know, part of what I was saying at the end of my talk is that we should look to other fields and other disciplines for those models. And again, and within literary studies, there can sometimes be a lot of resistance to that for many reasons. But I think those models absolutely exist, yes.
Excellent, thank you very much. And we have another question that I believe was during Abigail's presentation, but again, something that people, you know, since we're all working in interdisciplinary contexts, that I think anyone might be able to speak to. And this is from Dana. I wonder how concepts and assumptions about value are embedded in the representations and choices that students have to make between the humanities and the sciences, or the perceived choices. For example, extracurricular activity, even though it's a bridging area and discourse, can also be perceived as supplementary to value production, perhaps unnecessary or a distraction. And I'm embellishing the question just a bit to give it a bit more context. But if you'd like to speak to that, Abigail.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dana. This is a great question. So we actually asked something along these lines in our human subjects research, where we asked students to associate different values with different fields and see what they would match with what. And for the humanities, they were more likely to associate it with personal fulfillment and positive social impact. And the sciences was more associated with prestige and marketability. And so I think absolutely these ideas of what you would major in versus what you would do as an extracurricular are very much mapping onto different perceived values. And I think this is a really interesting question actually in terms of how people talk about the humanities as well, just kind of from my own personal view, is that often when humanities scholars are asked to justify the humanities or to give a defense of the humanities, I think two questions are very often conflated about value, which it's actually quite important, I think, to separate. So most people start by saying why the humanities are valuable, period. So why literature is valuable or why art is valuable. But that's not the question. I think the question that most students are asking is, they love the humanities. They think that literature is important too. They're asking why they should pay money to learn about the humanities in college. That's a really, really, really different question. And I think that as a field, the humanities often tends to group those things in a way that's unhelpful to students who have valid financial concerns. So I think ways of integrating the humanities with other disciplines, as we've heard of these other fantastic presentations, is helping to kind of achieve a more holistic understanding of these kinds of value structures.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you, Abigail. Would any of our other presenters like to speak to this question of value? I'm sure as humanities or humanities associated scholars, you've run into it several times.
I mean, I can say a bit in that we learned in the program that we're doing that values is really the glue that holds everything together. That that people come to our program because we've started, you know, communicating it as a program for, you know, for researchers who value, you know, have justice-oriented values. And so it's a little different use of the word, but I think but it's been this sort of like, it's the value around a value around community, a value for like bringing about some sort of particular change in the world. It's really also, as I've learned with as we've moved on, it's a value for care that, which I think bridges a lot of what Kalindi and others have been talking about, Nikki, you as well, is that, you know, I think people really appreciate having a space where, one, the fact that they care about things is something they can talk about, and that they can care for each other, and that it's okay to care for themselves. Like that they have it validated that they don't need, in fact should not sacrifice themselves and their well-being for their research.
Absolutely. And I think that the hyper-productive model of academia and perhaps particularly the laboratory model, tends to sort of glorify this idea of sacrificing yourself to your research in, I think, unhealthy and unsustainable ways. I actually have a follow-up question for Kalindi and Sarah with regard to that, though I'd also like to hear what Nikki perhaps has to say with regard to the research that she's doing. Do you find that when you have conversations about anti-racist or feminist approaches to STEM or to science or science education, that the sort of background assumption from a number of people is that the onus is on women and people of color to do all of this work? And if so, and of course, that's a bit of a loaded question because the answer is, of course, yes. I see you all smiling and nodding. If so, how do you combat that and tell people that, no, this is the work of everyone, not just the people who are marginalized? And anyone who'd like to speak to that.
I can speak to that, and also I really want to quickly say, like, the values question is a really important one and a hard one. I know as a first gen undergrad, I was very tempted by the lure of potentially like getting money if I pursued physics, and then I realized that I could not do that. But to this question, as a graduate student, it's definitely something I am reinvestigating, because before I came here for 5 years, I was a community college instructor. And so now I'm back in the student seat, and I'm kind of reinvestigating things that I did as an instructor, like all of the extra emotional labor and care that I was like so happy to do, but I was seeing my like male colleagues especially like get away with not doing that. And I think I mean, I don't have a perfect ready answer yet. I don't know if people do, but I think what I'm doing is, at least as a student, is asking of that emotional labor also from male committee members. I cried in front of one last week.
I'm sorry.
Well, no, I you know, just as a fourth year trying to figure out my dissertation, and I think normalizing care and normalizing love as methodology and normalizing like a lot of the things that we're talking about, and making the institution into what we want it to be rather than one that we have to like work to fit into. Like I remember when I got my acceptance letter for UCSB, I was just like, I'm gonna make them make room for me. All of my glitter and all of my drag and all of my like, like they're gonna take it as it is. And I think that is part of it. I also think that it is kind of amplifying that and making that work with how we teach and how we just engage with the institution to, you know, make the humanities humanize, and to make sure that we're engaging people not just like as automatons, but like as actual people, and encouraging our students to do the same. And also like making sure that we're holding maybe people who don't hold themselves accountable to the same things to maybe consider like the dark side of care and concern and doing emotional labor, etc.
Certainly. Absolutely. Thank you, Nikki. Now, do any of our other panelists want to speak to this idea of value and care, and the idea of essentially teaching various students and peers to take responsibility for these questions they may not immediately see as their own?
I can say a few things. I'm trying to pick which ones because I have a lot to say, but I picked two things that I can talk about. So at the same time as Sarah and I are doing this curriculum project, we've organized a group of faculty and administrators across campus to come up with a list of best practices for the administration to address racism in research culture. And that group has made it clear that one of the most important things we need to do is get institutional recognition for this labor that women and BIPOC people are doing. so that they get credit, but that also once that labor becomes valued by the institution, it becomes, people are incentivized to do it. And then the other example, actually, I was thinking about during Abigail's presentation was when I was a professor at UC San Diego in ethnic studies, I would have a lot of students in my race, class, gender, STS undergrad courses who were double majoring in science fields. And my classroom, they would have an experience in my classroom, and maybe others of you have students who've have done this too, where for the first time they could be both of themselves at the same time. They could value both of those parts of their lives at the same time. And then, now years later, they email me when they get into medical school or public health programs, and they tell me how that those experiences allowed them to bring together their social justice commitments and their training in the sciences, which was important because they're first generation or they're, immigrant descendant or whatever it is that made them feel that the science choice had to be the professional choice, which I respect, rather than the ethnic studies or humanities choice. And I think, the takeaway for that is the classroom, as Bell Hooks says, can be the most radical space in higher education. And so I do believe that pedagogy is a way to make this happen, regardless of how our students identify in terms of gender or other backgrounds.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I'm just posting in the chat here a truly excellent blog post that we had from one of the undergraduate researchers on the What Everyone Says project with regard to exactly, as you were saying, Lindy, the idea of being able to be both yourselves and suddenly not making it an either or choice, but something that is mutually reinforcing. So in the last 5 or 7 minutes that we have, I'd like to open the floor for panelists to ask one another questions, if you'd like, and while encouraging participants to also put questions in the chat should they occur to you.
I had a question for Nikki, and it's sort of maybe more procedural, but I was just sort of interested in hearing your thoughts as someone doing research on community science, and sort of how that process has gone for you as a graduate student, what it's like to do this research within history. I don't know, it just strikes me as, I don't know a lot about history, but it strikes me as somewhat unusual dissertation project. And so, yeah, I'd just like to hear about methods and process for how it's been.
So not my dissertation topic, but definitely something I'm interested in. I think some of it comes from my undergrad was not physics, but ended up being English, philosophy, and American studies. So like I just had like a trifecta of like, let's examine culture. And I think that that's really helping me out with this project. Procedurally, just doing research in Redwood country has been very interesting as a lady. Definitely had a couple loggers make inappropriate comments, and so that hasn't been fun. But in thinking about community science and thinking about how to like look at knowledge creation in kind of a like mini labscape of folks getting up to like scientific mischief, it's actually been really useful as a way to narrow down my focus, because I feel like for so long I was just carrying around a picture of saying of a redwood saying like, this is my dissertation, but this gives me a way to kind of focus in on something and be able to look at how that thing changed over time instead of trying to historicize something that is a living fossil. So I hope that that kind of gets at the crux of your question. But
Excellent, thank you so much. Do we have other questions?
I have a question for Kalindi and Sarah, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so thank you so much for your talk. I really, really enjoyed learning about your work. And I'm just curious how you have found ways to talk to employers about some of the questions that you're thinking about. So do you find, I guess I'm curious about this kind of feedback loop from changing the educational practices that would make it more commonplace and necessary, expected, that a student in a science discipline would have this kind of knowledge that you all are emphasizing. And how do you get that from the classroom to the priorities of somebody making hiring decisions in a corporate space? You mentioned that ways of community health organizations that are hiring students that you are training, which I just thought was a really, really exciting model. And so I'm curious how you have those kinds of conversations of changing the culture of actual hiring priorities in these kinds of settings.
Sarah, did you want to say anything about that? So the project I described is not even in beta yet. It's a proposal that we're trying to get the right funders for. So it's a kind of, we're not lucky enough to be talking to employers yet, but what I would say, I can tell you that. So it's my understanding from people who are working in the technology sector that the urgency of addressing diversity, equity, and inclusion issues, as they're called in industry, the urgency is undeniable for leadership. And so it's beginning to be seen as a leadership skill to be able to analyze how an organization can address so-called diversity and inclusion issues. And so I think one way to do it would be to present people with background in, what I would call ethnic studies, critical race and ethnic studies, and gender studies as having the social analytical skills, the critical thinking skills to be able to look at organizations, human resources, whatever it is that they're thinking of, but also to build teams that take these very important considerations into account. And I don't imagine it's much different than talking to upper level administrators and looking at Sarah to see if she if she feels the same, which we do a lot. And I think that the audience there, what they want to hear is that the work will still meet the qualifications and the values of the organization and have this sort of other effect, which is it will recruit and retain a diversity of people, which there's data to show that that's the case. So that's the kind of underpinning to the argument, I'd say.
And the only thing I might add to that quick is that, I think that I find that, we are we always are talking about this project across multiple registers. So for example, we will be giving a version of this to the Office of Research staff tomorrow. It will be the same and also very different. And I think that is actually a skill in and of itself that, our students have that I don't, and again, it's just finding I think it is it's another form of, some people call code switching or whatnot, but I just wanted to mention that as well.
Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you. That's excellent. So we're just about at the hour. So I believe that we should wrap things up here unless maybe we have time for just one more question if people have something that's really burning on the edge of their tongue. All right, I think I mixed metaphors there. I apologize. Excellent. Well, please join me in thanking our excellent panelists today and the fantastic work that they're doing across disciplines, the collaborative and pedagogical and community research, and just really cool work, fostering, facilitating, and everything in between. Thank you so much for coming and speaking to us today, and I hope you have an excellent night. Thank you.
Thank you so much.